Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Managing Global R&D in Turbulent Times. The webinar today is presented by Gunjan Bagla, Managing Director at Amritt. My name is Supriya Pandey, and I am a Senior Global Consultant at Amritt. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to go over a few logistical details. If you are logged in, you should see before you the first slide of the presentation. Please maximize this window and confirm that you can see the entire screen. You will also see a webinar applet which allows you to send us questions throughout the session. The speaker, Gunjan, will answer the questions either throughout the course of the session or at the very end as he deems fit. In case you run into any technical issues, please call 1-805-617-7001. You might be asked for a meeting ID, which you can retrieve from the confirmation email we sent you, and it is also available at the bottom of the webinar applet. During the course of the webinar, in case we have time, we will be conducting interactive polls and would really appreciate your your participation. And if there are any questions after the webinar, please do feel free to email us at usa@amritt.com. That's usa@amritt.com. I would now like to go ahead and introduce the featured speaker, Gunjan Bagla. Gunjan Bagla is the Managing Director of Amritt and has over 25 years of industry experience in marketing and sourcing. A mechanical engineering graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Kanpur in India, Mr. Bagla also holds an MBA with honors from Southern Illinois University. He has previously held senior positions in large corporations as well as been an entrepreneur himself. He also travels extensively to India and China. Based in California, Gunjan is the author of the book, Business in 21st Century India, How to Profit Today from Tomorrow's Most Exciting Markets, published in July 2008 by Warner Hachette Books. He also leads the executive seminar, Business with India, at Caltech, California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. And these seminars and books are a direct result of his work as a business consultant for major Western clients such as Reckitt Benckiser, Midway, Vivendi, and Paramount Farms, to name a few. He has been quoted extensively in the LA Times and other global media, and on the Amritt homepage, you can see a list of his speaking engagements. His articles have appeared in Business Week, CIO Magazine, Purchasing Magazine, and many others. So without further ado, here is Gunjan Bagla.
Thank you, Supriya, and welcome to all of you who have joined in from across the US and Canada today. We're going to get started here. The agenda today is really talking about innovation and then some R&D opportunities and how we see the business models playing out. It's important that we also talk about some of the challenges in global R&D. And then I'll make some suggestions about next steps. Now, the global innovation practice of Amritt is a big part of what we do, and many of our clients are among the largest R&D spenders in the world. We also do business with mid-sized and emerging companies who have an interest in global R&D. So you'll get a perspective that includes value regardless of your size. In these times of very high unemployment and difficult economic situations, it's important to remember that this may actually be a good environment to drive innovation. And to look at that, we went back into history and looked at what happened during the Great Depression. Here are some pictures of products that were first introduced during the Great Depression. The Waring blender, the Pine Sol cleaning solution, the Scotch tape from 3M. All of these were first introduced during the very difficult times of the Great Depression, and each of them enabled their particular companies to improve market share and to increase their sales in very difficult times. So today, I think you have to keep this in mind when we see all of the pressures placed on R&D departments, and if we have a chance, we'll ask you in our interactive polls what your particular situation is. For the last several years, we've been displaying this slide. This is our hypothesis of what is happening to global R&D. We believe firmly that corporations and executives who embrace the trends towards global R&D collaboration will do much better than those who don't. And in fact, we believe that the tough economic times will again separate the people who are doing more of this from the people who are not doing as much. We also believe very firmly that the countries of China and India and perhaps a couple of other emerging economies will play an increasing role in their share of both R&D and product development services. The first two messages may be scary for Western managers. The first because it means that you have to change dramatically, and the second because it means that the center of gravity is shifting, perhaps. But we firmly believe that Western companies and the West in general will maintain or enhance its lead in innovation despite the first two trends, and this will be driven by the fact that Western companies and Western organizations have historically been very nimble in adapting to opportunities and challenges presented to them. So we've been displaying this slide pretty much the same way for the last 2 years, and we think that we are very confident that these trends will continue at least to 2013, perhaps as far as 2015. Let's talk about innovation for a moment. As we know, innovation has been the core of Western prosperity, starting with the Industrial Revolution. And particularly in the United States, the large central corporate labs of IBM and Bell Labs and others drove the innovation around intellectual property and its monetization from the period beginning after the Second World War for several decades. But this began changing in the 1980s, and there was an article in the New York Times talking about how the great corporate labs are starting to disappear. At the same time, products, regardless of industry, have become far more complex and far more modular in many ways. So innovation is no longer just about the best light bulb. It's also about system architecture and about innovative business models. Think about the iPod and how it changed the business model around music. There are many examples we can talk about how innovation has been not just around the technology, but also around the way the product is offered or the service is offered to the consumer. Look at software as a service, for example. The same kind of thing is happening. Coupled with all of this is the shortened time to market that makes it desirable for VPs of R&D and Chief Technology Officers to accelerate the product cycle going from start to finish, and at the same time the labor costs for development are going up. So all of these factors have led people to say, well, what can I do that can be done outside my company, where I can leverage external resources? And this is what we will talk about further. So keep in mind that R&D globalization is not something that just came out of the blue. In some sense, global R&D has been going on for a while, but it's been primarily American, European, and Japanese companies driving investments among themselves. The U.S. has certainly been the largest investor of R&D resources overseas, primarily into Western Europe and Japan, but it's also the world's largest recipient of R&D resources. So it is a two-way street. This is very important to remember. So all we are seeing happen now is that there are some new players on the scene. India and China have started to become recipients of global R&D. To some extent, they have also started becoming contributors to global R&D. And we expect that this trend will continue to accelerate. In studies of the most innovative companies across the world, we find time and time again, no matter who does the study, that the more innovative a company is, the more likely it is that they are spending much of their R&D budget outside of their home country. So whether it is Philips spending money outside of the Netherlands, or Siemens spending money outside of Germany, or IBM hiring people in Europe and India, you see more and more of that. Many of you might be concerned about what's happening within your companies and whether there should be a sense of uneasiness about outsourcing in these difficult times. So here is a slide that should make you feel better. This is, as I said earlier, a two-way street. And the U.S. is the largest investor of R&D resources overseas, but is also the largest recipient. And the most nimble companies are accelerating their flows in both directions. The other thing to keep in mind is that revenue growth for most American companies today is going to happen outside the United States. So if you want to sell into Southeast Asia, you want to sell into China, into Latin America, into Eastern Europe, it only makes sense that some of the development of your products, the localization, be done close to the market. So that's the other factor that is driving R&D globalization. Now, how many different forms can this take? This slide talks a little bit about that, that it is available in many forms. There are turnkey specialists that will design a complete product for you, much like the ODMs out of Taiwan and other countries that do electronic products. There are similar companies that can do a complete software product, a complete drug, medical devices, you name it. So this is one category of company or operation, and so they combine design as well as manufacturing. There are other companies that offer a very specific service. We've worked many times with our clients in helping them find a product testing partner, whether it is testing a software product, or it is testing a food product, or it is testing a mechanically designed product or sample of such products. So testing is a very common function that can be taken overseas depending on your particular situation. Upstream in the product development process are patent reviews and other services related to the development and monitoring of intellectual property. And we find that this is a very fertile ground for services from overseas. Many of our large and mid-sized clients have found it of value to supplement their onshore IP resources with the work being done offshore as well. Then you come to companies that perform very specific elements of the R&D cycle, such as semiconductor chip verification, such as finite element analysis for the design of mechanical or civil structures. In the video game business, we have had companies outsource the development of complex game art. The main characters or the auxiliary characters in a modern video game can take hundreds or thousands of hours to develop, and these kinds of things are easily outsourced, provided you understand the parameters. We've had clients have their tooling and their prototypes, the fixtures, developed offshore. Again, you have to decide what is core and what is context, and whatever is context is a candidate for consideration of outsourcing. So there are many companies that specialize in these various functions. Some of our clients choose to go to large research partners. They may currently be doing research at universities, at national labs in the US, and they are finding it of value to look at similar institutions or entities located in the emerging economies. And we have many such engagements in recent years where we have taken mid-sized or large companies to China or to India or other countries. There's a fourth category which only is mentioned because they're somewhat different from the other three, and they may do any of the work described above, but these are the large IT services companies, primarily out of India. Companies such as Tata Consultancy Services or Wipro or HCL, they're mostly IT service companies. I'd say 70 to 90% of their revenue might come from conventional programming or IT support, but they've also built vibrant practices around the support of product development type of work. And some of these companies are now over 100,000 employees. So you may find that their product development staff, even though their revenue from product development is a small portion of the overall amount that they make, it is still a substantial number of people, and their R&D team in your particular area may actually indeed be bigger than your own team. This is a good time for us to try and conduct a poll, if we can. So let's ask what's happening in 2010 to your R&D budget. If you can take a moment to answer this this question, I would really appreciate it.
I would also like to encourage the audience to please send us any questions you might have using the question applet, and Gunjan will answer the questions throughout the session. Thank you.
Okay, seems like a couple of people might be having trouble voting, so I'm going to give another second or two. The answers are anonymous. We'll just get the summary results, so you don't have to worry about revealing internal company details. All we will show you is the overall results. Let me go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So this is interesting. 2/3 of you found that the budget went up a little, and 1/3 of you found that it went down significantly. So we are still seeing a mixed bag in this sense. A year ago, most people were saying that their budgets went down significantly. So some of them have now returned to allocating more money for R&D, and that's an encouraging sign. So there are many ways to react to economic stress, and we modeled a couple of them here. Let me hide the poll results so you can see my next slide. So one approach is certainly to try and increase the productivity of R&D resources by using leverage from overseas resources. The idea is that if you do this in difficult times, you can start to gain market share as soon as the economy starts to turn around or your market starts to turn around. And I encourage you to think about this approach if your company isn't already following it. I mentioned earlier that there are many different models of distributed development, and by distributed development I mean any kind of development that takes place outside your business unit's main facility where R&D is happening. So you can, the simplest method is to find an offshore supplier that helps you, and this requires the least amount of effort, but it also gives you the least amount of leverage. So this is the box at the bottom left. Now, at the top right is the captive offshore entity where you decide to set up your own unit, where people working for your company are performing R&D in an emerging economy. So this, of course, gives you the highest leverage because there's no third party taking a share of the profits and a share of the control. But it is also the most difficult to establish, the hardest to ramp up, and does have higher risk because you are now putting employees on your payroll in another country, and should things change and you decide to scale down, you are now subject to risking your brand image in that country, as well as the employment laws and practices of that country. There are intermediate models that people have tried to evolve as a result. So one that is used by many companies in other fields is called build, operate, and transfer, where you hire a third party to create this offshore entity. They hire the people, they run it, and at some point, by pre-arranged contractual agreement, you have the right to take all or partial control of this entity. So this BOT model also comes in many, many other flavors, which I won't get into right now. But this is an attempt by many Western companies to minimize the risk or manage the risk of working with overseas R&D personnel. As you can imagine, this risk minimization is not free because whichever third party you want to involve is going to want a premium for for your right to be able to take that business away from them and transfer it to yourself. But in some cases, this model does work. I won't dwell on the other models here on this slide in today's presentation, but there are ways that you can set up joint ventures to support R&D or do a non-cash kind of setup with a third-party collaborator. And let me move on to the next slide. We have found our PRND PRNDL model to be a convenient way to represent the different types of R&D collaboration that Western companies can leverage from. So let me start with the type 1, which we call the tactically reactive model. This is what most companies think about when they think about global R&D at first. They're looking to reduce cost. And so they say, well, can I save a buck by going overseas? Sometimes it's driven by layoffs or by economic conditions in the U.S. Sometimes it's driven by other reasons. But the bottom line really comes down to, hey, if I can save a buck, I will do it. There is a place for this kind of model, but generally we tell heads of R&D if this is the only motivation, then chances are that you are not going to be as happy with global R&D as you could be. And so we encourage people to look at the additional types as well. So in type 2, you're saying, well, I want to increase my capacity and I want to convert my fixed R&D cost to variable cost. So, for example, we had a mid-sized R&D organization here in California, and they chose to do all of their capacity increases when they received some very large pieces of business. They said, we won't hire more people in our central office here because land is expensive, hiring the new people is hard, and we don't want to have to lay them off once business goes back to its normal level. And so they chose to do all of the additional expansion with an overseas partner, in this particular case in a combination of a facility near New Delhi, India and Shanghai, China. They used two different suppliers, and so they were able to increase their capacity of staff and of production by more than 100% without having to put up additional capital or sign additional leases. This is one very common way that people can use the type 2 type of model. Another situation happened with a different client some years ago, but they were very happy with their current supplier located in the United States, but they wanted to add a second source because they were concerned that this supplier was too dependent on the business from our client, and they wanted to be sure that if the supplier decided to sell or go out of business, that they weren't going to be trapped. So they decided to develop a second source, and this time they went offshore to develop the second source. They had no intention of abandoning their primary supplier. In fact, they informed them, and at our recommendation, we said, let the supplier know that you're going to do this so that they don't get nervous and they don't get worried. And it turned out to be a very fruitful kind of method. At this point, this particular client I'm talking about continues to use both sources. So this is a model that many of our clients have used. Let's move on to what we call the tactically proactive type of work. So now you're getting beyond the kinds of things that you are already doing. And you're saying, I need some new skills. Say you are a company in the chemicals business and now you need to, because of changes in technology or changes in the market, you need to hire mechanical engineers. Or you're a company that works mostly in natural materials and you now need to get into synthetic materials. You're a software company, you need to start producing hardware. So you could try and hire these additional skills within the US or Canada or Western Europe, wherever you might be located, but your company isn't known in that field for being a good home for that kind of talent. And you may have some difficulty hiring the best talent because the best talent may not want to come to work for you in that particular field. So here's another opportunity where you can say, instead of hiring, I have 100 electrical engineers, instead of hiring 5 mechanical engineers in Boston, let me hire 9 mechanical engineers in China or in India. And I say hiring, this could be your own staff or this could be at an outsourced facility. Let's just say that you increase your headcount by, instead of 5 in the West, by say 8 or 9 in a low-cost country. And so you get the additional talent. They're happy to come to work for you or for your supplier because they're well entrenched in that market, or your brand is attractive in that market, and you can add the additional capacity and the additional skills. One of the reasons why you might go into this model is where your company is thinking of expanding its products into that market. And this is quite true of China, India, and other emerging economies. So people say, well, let me do my localization of my product in that market. So let me hire the formulation engineers, the localization engineers, perhaps some of the local regulatory staff that can meet with the needs of the local market. Let me hire those people in the emerging economy. So this is what we call as the type 3 or tactically proactive type of model. Type 4 is what very few companies achieve, and if they do achieve it, they only achieve it in certain parts of their ecosystem. And this is where you look at developing any product for any market in any country. You may have a Western product being developed in China or India. You may have a product for the Chinese market being developed in the West. You may do a combination thereof, and then your supply chain is independently managed across these countries, regardless of the ultimate destination for the product. We have many such examples of our clients who have gone to this stage, but typically only to a small portion of their business. I really can't say that there's any company operating fully at the type 4 model that I know about. Let's move on and talk about what some of the issues are around the creation of this opportunity. And this is displayed very well in these two graphs. So if you look at the number of engineers being produced in China, the United States, and India, you'll see that there's substantial technical staff coming out of the emerging economies. Now, you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt, because what an engineer means in China versus the US versus India is different, and many people have questioned the very high number you see for China, for example. Some of those people are really technicians rather than engineers. But what the important thing is that there's lots of engineers coming out of these countries. On the flip side, you look at R&D expenditure in these countries, and you see that the US and the European Union spend a far greater percentage of their GDP on the R&D budget. So there's a gap. There are R&D capable people that aren't finding R&D oriented work in these countries, and by being nimble and smart and quick, you can take advantage of this gap to be able to benefit your company. You have to keep in mind that today the dynamics of the emerging country markets have changed, and sometimes a collaborator in a country such as China or India, particularly if you're talking about a university or a lab, is looking for more than just money. Money alone is not going to drive them to do a collaboration with a remote location, and you have to find non-monetary compensation to be able to excite them. We often suggest specific ideas depending on the client's situation and capability, whether it is access to Western markets, whether it is the cachet of working with a Western company, whether it is the exchange of intellectual property and mutual licensing. Could be any of the above. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. We find that you can learn from the emerging economies just as much, and we did some work around what we call frugality, with this move towards green and towards simplicity that we see in the West. We found some nice examples in emerging economies. Here's soap being sold without any packaging. Clearly, you have to do some design changes, but if you look at the bar on the left and the bar on the right, you'll see that these are products that are being sold in rural India, and it certainly has helped build an ecosystem of companies that are quite profitable selling product that involves no packaging at all. At the bottom right is a picture of India's answer to Barnes & Noble. This is one of the largest bookstores in Bangalore, and you can see that they pack their books very densely. So their sales per square foot are probably significantly higher than an equivalent bookstore in the West. But the system works, and they are able to still find titles and make an efficient model around their business. Again, the point I'm trying to make is that it's not just about the product; it's also about distribution and specific examples of what we at Amritt have done to help our product development clients. So some years ago, we were approached by one of the top American brands. It's a brand that all of you know well, but I can't name it. And they are in the consumer electronics / toys business. They had a problem because there was a gap in their product development schedule due to the failure of one of the chip designs to be out on time. So they decided that they needed a new product based on a different Taiwanese chipset, and they needed to get it out at a certain time frame to be able to compete in the market, to be on the stores at Walmart and Best Buy and Toys R Us, but they didn't have the internal resources to be able to do this. So we set up a collaboration between 4 separate suppliers located in China, India, and Taiwan. We hired a number of vendors and put it together. Here you can see that the assembly language work was done at one supplier, the mechanical design was done at another place, the art at a third place, and the product was still able to make it to market in time and under budget. Now the client was not driven to do this because of budgetary reasons. Historically they had done most of their work stateside, but they found this experience to be so pleasurable that they decided that in the future that they would do a significant amount of development using a global model, as we had proven would work. So they were not driven by costs at all. The volumes of this product are so high that the cost of development is not really a major factor. It's really the idea that they can produce 20% more SKUs, they can have more designs, and they can make more bets. They can perhaps over time start to get more shelf space at Walmart because they have 2 products instead of 1 in a particular quarter. And if they're able to convince Walmart to stock both, they're more likely to have a sales win. This has proved very effective for this particular client as well as for some others who are similar. Here's an example from China. It's a little bit dated now, but a small company called the Tongfang Microelectronics Company developed these RFID chips that were used for sales, for ticket sales in the Olympics in Beijing. And you can see that this was jointly developed by Tsinghua University out of Beijing along with the commercial manufacturer. Here's an example of a large American company that has had tremendous success by using R&D resources in India. General Electric today at the Jack Welch Center in Bangalore, you see a picture of the Jack Welch Center at the bottom. They have over 5,000 researchers and development staff working in many, many different industries. But one of the products that came out of the Jack Welch Center is the Mac 400. The Mac 400 is a portable EKG device. It can run over 100 EKGs on a single battery charge. Now, why would you care about that? This is not something that you will see immediate application in the West, but in a country like China or India or in Africa, where you may have doctors going into remote areas in the villages in a van or a car, and they may be going to areas where, particularly in India and Africa, where they do not have reliable electricity. So having a battery-operated device is hugely important, and having something that is easily portable is hugely important. The Mac 400 has been on the market for some time, and it is perfectly imaginable that at some point the company may market a consumer version of this device for people in the West to use in their homes. Today we have blood sugar monitoring devices in our homes, and we have blood pressure monitoring devices in our home. Why not an EKG device at some point? So it's entirely conceivable that a technology first developed in India by a large multinational may make its way into the homes of American consumers in the near future. Let's take another example that I'm sure you heard about when it first was announced at the Delhi Automobile Show in about 2 years ago. The Tata Nano. This was a $2,500 car, the least expensive car in the world. But I'm not here to talk about the cost of the car. I really want to point out the innovative way in which Tata Motors chose to develop this car. Those of you who are familiar with automotive design might know that a new platform at a Toyota or a Hyundai or a General Motors or Ford typically takes 8 to 10 years, sometimes longer, to go from concept to market. Tata Motors took this Tata Tata Nano idea from concept to sales in 5 years. They also did this with a very young team. These weren't people who were first working for GM or Toyota and were hired into India. These were people working at Tata Motors. The average team age was under 30 years, and the team leader, Girish Wagh, whose picture is shown here at the bottom, was less than 35 years old when he became the leader of this team. Together with his group of several hundred engineers, Girish came up with a design that has a rear engine. In his effort to economize, it has a single windshield wiper. It was designed to be specific to the rough road conditions of India. And one way that they were able to accomplish this, of course, is to use external innovation and to lean on their suppliers. Bosch is the supplier of the aluminum pressure die-cast engine, and it's a brand new engine that Bosch designed for them. There are many other parts that were designed specifically at very aggressive cost and scheduled targets for the Tata Nano. It is entirely within Tata's plans to take this product and start to market it in other emerging economies, Africa, Latin America, and so on. We don't think we are going to see Tata Nanos on American roads anytime soon or ever, but it's certainly possible that you will see them as a vigorous competitor across the developing world. Let's now move on and talk about some of the challenges. But before I do that, let me run one more poll and get your opinion of what you think are the biggest worries about doing work in emerging countries. Would you go ahead and take a moment to answer my question here? What are your biggest worries?
And again, if you have any questions, please do send us your questions using the webinar applet, and we will answer the questions either now or at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, votes continue to come in, so I'm waiting another minute before closing the poll. So we have about half of you, almost 40% concerned about job loss, and the rest of you are equally divided among concerns around IP protection, quality and timeliness of work, and cross-cultural effectiveness. All of these are valid concerns, and I'll try and address each of them here as we go along. Let me hide the results and talk a little bit about separating fact from fiction. There's a lot of data and general information about R&D in emerging economies, and you have to treat all of that with a grain of salt. Certainly the number of people employed in R&D, the money spent on R&D, these government organizations that are supposed to help you, these are all interesting data points, but you may find that there's less there than meets the eye. On the other hand, it's very important to understand that there is tremendous innovation going on in China and in India and many other countries. Much of it is not driven by the government spending. Much of it is not widely reported, either because of strict confidentiality requirements by the Western counterparts, or because it is being done in very small, underfunded teams. So you sometimes have to look hard to be able to find this kind of information. But it absolutely exists, and we are being able to connect Western companies with the right types of partners in countries such as China, India, and Eastern Europe on a regular basis. So I have an example here of how something might mislead you. This is a picture at the bottom of a tree in the middle of the road. And the first time you look at it as a Western visitor, you might say this makes no sense at all because this is a huge traffic hazard and it's crazy. Well, if you know a country like India a little bit better, you might say, okay, but I understand why this might have happened. The large and complex bureaucracies in India weren't talking to each other, and the tree cutting department forgot to talk to the road building department, and they widened the road and left the tree in the middle. And that's a reasonable assumption. But if I gave you some more information, perhaps you would come to a different conclusion. If you travel to most Indian cities, you will find that they are chock full of traffic. And I took this photograph at a time when there weren't really many vehicles on the road. But on your average day, you will find that the space on the left-hand side of the road leading up to the tree is actually fully occupied with parked vehicles, with push carts, with pedestrians that are actually walking on the street. And then the tree doesn't really look like it is in the middle of the road at all. So it's still a bad idea, I think, to have a tree in the middle of the road, but perhaps not as bad as it looks at first. And my point is that you have to know how to peel away the layers in order to be able to understand how India functions. The same kind of thing is true of China. So if you're thinking about R&D outsourcing, you have to truly understand who you're working with. Some companies that claim to be R&D specialists are simply providing bodies. They're saying, here's a number of people that you can have work on your project, but you have to manage them. You have to provide the guidance and the innovation and so on. There are other companies and other situations where that is not the case. So you have to evaluate the particular team and the particular approach for you. Many of these companies may come to you and say, well, we have Boeing as a client or GE as a client, and that means we can do your work. Well, maybe not. Maybe Boeing or GE are able to command that kind of attention because they have a 500-person staff allocated to them. They've got the most talented people working on that account. Are you going to get that same level of talent? Or are you going to get the B team working for you? So sometimes you have to be careful in evaluating this. You can't take these types of shortcuts and simply assume that just because they are right for General Electric, they must be right for me. We in fact did some work for a client out of the Rocky Mountain states where they had been led down this path by one of the suppliers, and it turned out that they certainly weren't getting the A or the B team working for them. We were then able to reconfigure their work so that more of their work went to a much smaller company that could give them the same level of attention that the much bigger supplier was giving to a GE. Let's move on. There are significant challenges in these economies, and one of them is around the recruitment and retention of staff. Even in these difficult times, the economies of China and India are not doing so badly. And young talent that is capable is pretty much in demand. So you have to understand that suppliers in these countries are having to pay significant raises to their employees even in these difficult times. Here's where your brand can be an advantage if you do have an offshore center. Most well-known American brands are valued at a premium, and employees in China or India would much rather work for a well-known American or Canadian or European company. You lose this advantage if your brand is a startup or is not well known in those markets. Then you have to work a little harder. But just as much as your brand, we found that the immediate first-level management matters a lot to young and mid-level employees. You've got to be able to make sure that the first and second-level managers are trained, are attentive, are listening to the needs of their engineers and scientists. Just as important are career paths. In these companies, there is a particular folklore about how your career should grow, and it typically has to do with getting into management. Now, if you're an R&D executive, you may want some of your best people wanting to continue to work as individual contributors, particularly in the West. But in the emerging economies of India and China, you may find that somebody who's been doing something for 4 or 5 years will want to move into management, even though they're not really attuned towards management. So you have to help them define career paths that make sense for you and career paths that make sense for the environment that they work in and produce a happy blending. We have clients who are sending work to emerging economies where they've had zero turnover over the course of 2 and 3 years. And we also are aware of cases where people have had 50 or 100% turnover. A lot of this depends on how you relate to the staff overseas, whether they're working directly for you or working for a supplier. We advise our clients on doing many specific things to make sure that the staff in the overseas locations feels engaged and feels wanted and feels equal in various ways to your onshore staff. I think it's just as important to understand the impact of globalization on your stateside team. You saw in the opinion poll that a lot of people are concerned about job loss on the domestic team. That's an absolute concern, and you have to be able to handle that sensitively and thoughtfully. As I said earlier, for most of our clients, it's not just cost reduction that is driving them to global R&D. It is capacity increase, it's going and having access to new markets, and it's transforming the supply chain. And many of these don't involve job loss, but sometimes they do, and you really have to be upfront and straightforward with your domestic team. At the same time, the people who will be dealing with the overseas employees need to become cross-cultural communications experts. And typically, this is not something you learn in engineering school. Certainly, I didn't when I got my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. So you have to be able to provide the sensitivity and the awareness of how to communicate effectively across time zones and continents. The ability to communicate effectively remotely becomes a key skill. And we encourage our clients to develop protocols around how you write emails, how you run global conferences, what's the right role for instant messaging, where do you use it, where do you not use it, what's the kind of work that can be carried on in an IM box versus email versus a phone call. You also have to recognize that your work day and your work week is going to change. And this is simply a consequence of time zones. When it is Sunday night in California, it's already Monday afternoon in China and Monday morning in India. And most people who are working in the global role find that their BlackBerries start buzzing on Sunday night. They keep buzzing every evening, and they start buzzing early morning when you wake up. So your work day changes. And companies have to recognize that they need to allow for this. Flex time becomes an important consideration for your Western employees and project managers. Travel becomes a significant portion of the work of some of your Western as well as emerging country employees. When you travel within the U.S., typically you go out on a Monday morning and you're back by Wednesday or Thursday, or worst case by Friday. Well, when you travel all the way to Asia, chances are that there will be occasions where you will want to make a two-week or a 3-week trip. So you'll be spending weekends away from your family, and this becomes a burden on many Western employees and their families. It's something you have to keep in mind and keep into account. But go back to my very first slide where I talked about the career advantages for those people who do embrace global R&D. If you're willing to pay these costs in terms of your personal time, you may find that your career advances much more rapidly. Now, several of our clients, key employees, have chosen or requested assignments overseas, where they are spending a year in Bangalore or Hyderabad or Shenzhen or Beijing. Some are choosing to live in Hong Kong or Singapore and be able to manage resources in both China and India. And this can be a great opportunity for many professionals. So treat this as both a cost and an opportunity in my view. Let's conduct one more poll, if I may. Let's just ask what's happening, what's top of mind this year for you? What's your biggest challenge as you think of what's happening in the next 12 months? You can take a moment to answer this for me. While you are taking this poll, some questions came in from the time of registration, and let me try and address that. One of the attendees has asked about IP issues in both countries. And intellectual property is a serious concern for most Western companies. Let me talk about the legal situation first. So the World Trade Organization has something called the TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And India was a founding member of the WTO when it was created in 1995, and that meant that it committed itself to altering its laws to be TRIPS compliant. 99% of that process is complete today, and so the legal system in India is pretty strong. China joined the WTO several years later and has also largely converted its laws to meet the requirements of TRIPS. However, the problem is not so much in laws as it is today in enforcement. And in India, most Western companies feel that the compliance around enforcement is reasonably good. There are some significant exceptions. You can find DVDs of movies available on the streets in India, days, sometimes minutes after they are released, or sometimes even pre-release. But this happens to both Western and Bollywood movies. The same thing is true of software. You can find illegal copies of software being sold in the markets in India and China very readily. But when you look at other areas, you'll find that in general, India is pretty good about intellectual property compliance. In China, most of our clients have a higher degree of concern because some of the IP violations are happening at the corporate level, and they're happening in companies that may be partly owned by the state, and this is a more difficult problem that continues to plague several of our clients. Let me close the poll and see the results here. So we have a 2/3, 1/3 between accelerating the pace of development and managing global R&D. It's interesting that managing global R&D is figuring as one of the top concerns. A year or two ago, most people weren't seeing that as a significant concern because really they weren't doing enough of it for it to bubble up to the top. Interesting also that retaining staff isn't so much of a concern today. All right, so let me hide the results. We are coming pretty close to the end of the webinar. And the model here simply shows how evolution towards open innovation has taken a different course in the US than it has when you involve companies out of China or India. So we went from an integrated value chain to starting to source products from suppliers, and then starting to source assemblies, and then we moved on into collaborative development, if you will. Whereas what we found in recent years is happening from India and China is that yes, maybe we were purchasing some raw materials going back 20, 30 and 40 years, but beyond that, many companies began purchasing services and then establishing local R&D centers before moving into a full spectrum kind of development. So the order in which things have occurred has been different, but ultimately it still leads to the overall similar result. So let's talk now about next steps. We so firmly believe that turning to overseas resources and global collaboration makes much more sense today than it did just a few years ago. And we certainly believe that companies that will be aggressive about this will come out ahead when the economy starts to run at full steam again. As I said earlier, we also firmly believe that this is a good career move for most Western managers who choose to embrace globalization. Now, that can be a controversial claim, and if you disagree with that, please do send me email. I'd love to hear your point of view either way. But this has been our position and our observation looking at our clients. Here's my contact information, phone number as well as email. If you register on our website, you can download some white papers. We keep posting additional information from time to time on our website. So you're welcome to register on the site so you can start to get some of this. And at this point, let's see if we have any more questions. Supriya, is there anything from your side?
No, I think we're all set.
Okay, so let me see if the questions from registration, I believe, have been answered in one form or the other. So I'll hand it back to you, Supriya. Thank you all for joining today.
Thank you so much, Gunjan, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. We hope it was informative for you. If you have any additional questions, please do email us at usa@amritt.com. Again, that's usa@amritt.com. Please make sure that as you're exiting the webinar, you fill out a brief survey that is presented to you. We would appreciate your feedback since we are constantly looking to improve our webinars. If you have any friends or colleagues who you think might benefit from a similar webinar, please do have them register on our website, www.amritt.com, and we will notify them of any upcoming webinars. We host the webinars pretty frequently throughout the year. Thank you again very much for attending today, and have a nice day. Goodbye.